you like to start?
Yes.
Thank you.
So I guess I'll just start with how I started writing. I have always been a writer. My dad self-published a book before I was born and published a few more while I was young. And I just felt like it was this amazing human accomplishment to write a story that other people could read and other people would be inspired by. And another thing that my dad really instilled in me was this idea that everybody has a story. And even the smallest things can have significance and can have meaning. And so I kind of grew up with that that mindset, and I started writing stories pretty young, and yeah, I wrote my first novel when I was 14, and I didn't finish my second novel until I was married with 2 kids, and so that was a few years ago, 4 years ago, I think. And then I started really pursuing publishing and getting into the writing community, and my first full-length novel, I should say, came out in January. So, let's see. Is there anything like specific that you want me to go into with this?
At some point, we would love to hear about your historical research. That's a genre that we haven't really covered much, so we would love to hear more about that. But we'd love to hear anything you have to share.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so with historical research, I got into historical fiction when I was probably like 11 or 12. I started reading the big, huge series that Deseret Book puts out, like Work in the Glory and what are the titles? Faith of Our Fathers, I think, was one of my favorites, and Prelude to Glory, all of those historical fiction where you have like these big, huge families, and they're like 9-book series, and they're all about that big, and I just devoured them. I loved seeing these people and seeing history on kind of a personal level. I think you get into the history classes and you're learning about the most important people and the big events that happen, but I think sometimes it's easy to lose the idea that there were normal people that were going through these things too, and there were normal people who were affected by these things. And so I just really loved seeing these big events through the eyes of normal people. So that was kind of how I got into historical fiction. I got into Regency romance through Jane Austen. Jane Austen is a fantastic writer, and even if you're not in it for the romance, I would highly encourage you to read Jane Austen for the characters and for the like social commentary. Yes, at their core, they're romances, but Jane Austen had such an impressive grasp on human beings, and those characters just leap off the page. If you think about Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet and their reactions to each other and their interactions with everybody else, it just feels like they're real, and it feels like Jane Austen really knew what she was talking about. She was very good at observing and using that in her writing. So I came to Regency romance through Jane Austen, but I feel like my work is a little bit different from most Regency romance, not all of them. There are some that are similar to mine, but my books definitely walk the line between historical fiction and historical romance. In fact, my second book, my publisher is actually publishing as historical fiction rather than historical romance, even though it's very similar if you've read Georgiana's Secret, as far as the romance content versus the history content. But I really am very borderline, and I think it's because of that that love of the historical fiction when I was a teenager, and the love of Jane Austen that came a little bit later. So yeah, that's what drew me into historical fiction. And the thing with historical fiction, obviously, is you have to do a ton of research. When I started like seriously writing Regency, I researched for probably 2 or 3 years. I was writing a Regency at the time, but leading up to writing Georgiana's Secret, I was researching for 2 or 3 years. And it was kind of everything. I was reading books from the time, like Jane Austen. I was finding documentaries. I was finding books. And yeah, just kind of devouring as much as I could. I actually found this series that a library did. It was like kind of a book club, and they brought in some experts in the field, I guess you could say, to talk about it, and they had recorded it, and I really wish that I could find it again. The library took it down from off of their website, but it was just getting to listen to experts, I think was awesome. And one of the nice things I think about all of this online stuff that we have had to do in the last year is it's made those things much more readily available to a wider audience. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to find them, but as you get into research and as you get into different communities, you'll find events, like they just come to you. This year I was able to take an online sailing course. I was able to take a class in letter writing. I was able to take a class on Regency era makeup and Regency era hair, and just all of these things that I wouldn't have been able to do because most of these classes were done in person. So yeah, there's just so many different ways that you can research. One of my favorite parts of researching is actually like recreating stuff, whether that's cooking food that my characters would have eaten, or I'm into sewing, so I sew Regency dresses, and I'm getting into Georgian era dresses. And for Georgiana's Secret, I actually bought a thing of tallow, because there's this moment where she is like trying to moisturize her really rough hands with whatever she can find, and she finds tallow. And so I like bought this little can of tallow and was like rubbing it into my hands just to see what it would be like for her to do it. I went sailing on the Lady Washington, just a bunch of other things that really bring history and bring that time period to life. Kind of trying to step into my character's shoes and figure out what they would have experienced. So that's my favorite kind. Researching, there's a lot of books, it's true. I probably have, I think I'm close to 50 now, 50 research books. And I actually also get a lot online. Some of my favorite ways to research are using primary sources, because there's no other way that we can get close, I think, to recreating what life was like in the past if we didn't have those primary sources. And sometimes finding actual books from the time period or finding exactly what you want can be a little bit tricky, but websites like Google, their Google Books, is that what it is? Google Books, Google Play. They have a bunch of books that have been scanned in from the time period, and also archive.org. I have found cookbooks, I've found medical books that are very helpful, and things like that. And sometimes you have to go through a lot of other sites to be able to find exactly what you're looking for. But yeah, those are probably some of my favorites. Sorry, let's get into the chat and see if we have some questions. Okay, let's see, this is from Jordan. Is it hard to finish a book and make it as long as you would like? My problem is not getting it. I'm a very wordy author. So my issue is usually I have too many words. But yeah, sometimes it is really hard to finish a book. It can be. One thing that has helped me, I used to be a discovery writer. A discovery writer is someone who just sits down and writes and lets the story take them wherever it goes. And then you also have like a planner author who sits down and makes a very detailed outline, and they know everything that's going to happen before they sit down and start writing. And I'm a little bit in between, but I found as a discovery writer, I would get kind of lost. And so once I figured out how to outline, I found that it was a lot easier to keep going if I knew where I was going. And I don't make a very detailed outline. A lot of my outline is just, I'll have not even a full sentence, but just a phrase like they go to this village, or fight scene, or whatever. I think when I was writing Georgiana, I had some of them were just one word. I won't say all of them in case people want to read it, and I don't want to give anything away. But having a very basic outline for me was very helpful. Sometimes I don't know exactly where a scene or where a part of the book needs to go, but I know just the basic, I need something big to happen here, and just knowing that I need that to happen there, I can go in and fill in details as I'm writing and as the story is developing. So I'm a little bit in between on that, but it has definitely helped me be able to finish the book. And I think it's helpful too when I get writer's block, or I'm just on a really difficult scene, just knowing what's ahead, knowing what I need to push through to get to. That's been really helpful for me. How do you maintain the motivation during your novel writing process? This is from Audrey. Oh, this is actually something that I'm struggling with right now. I got into a K-drama, and it's been kind of ruling my life right now. So I haven't been very good at writing this week. But I think one of the big things for me was actually finding my people, finding a writing community, specifically finding my critique group has made it very, very helpful. So my critique group, we meet about every other week. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. And everybody will submit, not everybody, but everybody who has a chapter will submit a chapter, and we will talk about it. We'll give comments. We'll say what we like. We'll say what didn't work for us. And so having that as kind of a constant every other week has really helped to push me, like, oh, I need to have something to submit for this meeting. I've also found that I have a couple of writing friends that I will text and tell my goals to. So I'll be like, okay, I need to write every day this week. That's my goal. And they'll check in on me, and I'll do the same for them. Say, okay, how's this going? Or I'll be able to bounce ideas off of them if I'm stuck. And just having those relationships has really helped me, because we're all in the same boat. We're all trying to write, and most of my friends are also moms and in my same situation, and so we can kind of commiserate on the difficulties of finding time to write and things like that. So finding people who write what you do, write in the same genre, people who are in a similar life situation, all of that has been really helpful. And it is also helpful to have more advanced writers to kind of be mentors and kind of push you in other ways. But I think finding people that you can relate to is very helpful for this, because writing is it can be a very lonely job, I guess you could call it. I don't know. It's hard to think of it as a job for me, because it's just so much part of my life. But it can be lonely. I mean, it's you sitting in front of a computer or sitting in front of a notebook. And so it's just really helpful to have the input of other people. Let's see. Okay, from Sarah, how do you make sure your dialogue fits the time period? Oh, this one. This one is a really interesting thing, and there are a lot of debates about it in the historical fiction community. You kind of have a wide spectrum of what people think the dialogue should be like. So you'll have authors who are very modern, and it feels like their characters are just modern people in a historical setting. And then you'll also have people who it sounds like their characters came straight from Jane Austen or straight from a historical book. And there are downsides to both, I think. If you are too historical, sometimes it's not going to make sense to a modern reader, because words change, and language changes and meanings change. And so sometimes you do have to use a more modern word or a more modern way of saying things, just so that you're not confusing your readers and sending the wrong message. But then also, I think, you just have to be careful with it. Sometimes it can alienate your readers as well. Sometimes it can be harder for them to connect. I think modern readers will give historical writers like Charles Dickens and Jane Austen and William Shakespeare, they'll kind of give them a pass if they're not super clear to a modern audience, but they won't always give those same allowances to a modern author. So it's just things to be mindful of. And then on the flip side, you'll have readers who, if something is very, very modern, it will pull them out of the story. So you kind of just, it's all about personal preference. For me, I kind of try to go down the middle. And I try not to have too many phrases that are so modern that people that it'll pull people out, but also make it clear and make it readable for a modern audience. One thing that I have found that really helps me to get into a historical dialogue mindset is listening to Jane Austen audiobooks. And you have to be careful about which reader you choose, but a lot of times if I'm struggling, I'll just turn on my favorite Jane Austen audiobook and listen to the phrasing, because it's one thing to read it, for me, it's one thing to read that dialogue and a completely different thing to hear it. And I kind of need to hear it in my head, hear my characters saying those things to be able to get it right. So for me, listening to it. And I like it. I mean, you can do the same thing with movies. But I like listening to just the pure book. Because movies change the lines and change the dialogue frequently. So that's probably my favorite trick to getting historical dialogue correct. Okay. This is from Jordan. How do you make sure that your book is flowing, not too fast, not too slow, and boating? I don't know what that means, but I will respond to the first part of the sentence. How do you make sure that it's flowing? So one thing that was immensely helpful for me was learning about story structure. And it's something that I'm always studying, actually. There are a lot of different tricks and methods for story structure, and learning about all of the different ones is really helpful, because some stories I use one type of story planning, and other stories I use different ones. So like 7-point story structure is one that is really helpful. There's the Save the Cat, which it started out as a film story structure thing, but they actually have another book that is specifically for novel writers. But yeah, there are a lot, and I think learning about story structure really helps to make sure, that you're hitting all of those beats that need to be in the story. One thing that was really helpful for me when I was starting to pursue publishing was listening to Writing Excuses. They are the podcasts that Brandon Sanderson does with a few other authors, and they have several seasons where they go through story structure. And the nice thing is, their podcasts, they're only 15 minutes long-ish. And so they're just in like bite-sized pieces, and they give you something to think about, which was really nice to kind of help cement the idea that stories need this and stories need that. And so that really helps, especially with planning and outlining your novels. My favorite Jane Austen novel, this is a hard one. I think Pride and Prejudice is, just because I love that cast of characters. Like, great casts of characters is huge for me. I just love it. I love the hero and the heroine and the small like main character group, but I just think stories that have great secondary characters are amazing, and they just feel all that more real to me, because it really does feel like your secondary characters are the heroes in their own stories, and that there's more going on in the background, and it just makes it, like I said, it just makes it more real for me. And I love the cast of characters that she has in Pride and Prejudice, and all the ways that they play off of each other. And yeah, so I would say that. I do really like Persuasion. I don't think it's as polished as the rest of her work because she just didn't have time to do it. I love that story. And I would really love to have seen what it might have been if she had had that time to polish it. How do you sift through all that you learn from your research and decide what to include in your novel? This is a hard one for me because when you're researching, you just find so many amazing things. And it's hard for me to not want to include all of it. But in every single novel that I've written, I've had to cut pieces of historical information that I really, really wanted to put in there. And I think one thing that is really helpful is every scene needs to advance the plot in some way. And every piece of the story needs to advance your plot in some way. And if you are adding something in and it's not advancing your plot, then it probably needs to go. And sometimes it's hard to know if it is advancing your plot, which having beta readers, having critique partners is huge for that, because they'll be like, this was kind of slow. And the slow parts, you can go back and see, oh yeah, I added in this really cool piece of historical information and it doesn't need to be in there. So, yeah, that's a hard one for me. Let's see, what are some of the biggest challenges in writing a historical fiction novel? I think finding things it depends on what you are writing a novel about. So Georgiana's Secret, I was actually able to find what I needed fairly easily. I joined a lot of Facebook groups that were specific to the Royal Navy. And it actually ended up being immensely helpful for me, because these were all people who were enthusiasts, who had been reading historical fiction for years. Some of the people in these groups were actually like historical consultants for movies and things like that. And so being able to like read their conversations about different things and ask them questions was very helpful. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Challenges in writing historical fiction. But I found, so the book that I'm writing now is French Revolution. I have a book coming out in February that is French Revolution, and this one's kind of a sequel of sorts to that. And I have found that when you get outside of like the main history, that's when it gets a little bit more challenging. Finding the daily life stuff that really makes your novel come to life can be really tricky. So this book is set in Brittany during the French Revolution, and there's so much going on in Paris that it's a lot harder to find information about Brittany. So yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things. Another difficult thing is reader expectations. A lot of readers kind of have it set in their mind what a historical time period should be like. And one example of this, so there is a lot of Regency fiction that they have pulled Victorian era values into the Regency era. The Victorian era, they were a lot more strict on a lot of things, and they were a lot more proper and a lot more stingy on social things than they were in the Regency era. But a lot of writers have kind of pulled that, and not just in writing, I mean movies and stuff as well. They have kind of pulled from the Victorian era and put it into the Regency era. And people see that in movies and they see that in books and they assume that that's how it was, when in reality it's another era being kind of put over the top. And so sometimes they will look at something in one of your books and say, oh, that's not historically accurate, when in fact it's your stuff that's historically accurate rather than where they got it from. So that can be a little bit difficult, managing reader expectations, and sometimes it means you have to put in a little bit more explanation or something like that. But yeah, you have a lot of historical fiction readers who are very, I don't know if picky is the right word, but if they see something that they think is incorrect in your book, they will not be happy about it. So that's always an interesting thing that we have to keep in mind as historical fiction writers. Let's see, do you base your characters off of people you meet and see in real life? Not directly. Like I don't know that I have ever like copied and pasted a person into a novel, but I have definitely pulled traits from people that I've met. I've pulled like snippets of conversation from people that I've overheard or conversations that I've had, little moments that I've had with family members or friends, things like that. Yeah, I think there's a pretty popular phrase that gets thrown around the writing world that is write what you know. And a lot of people hate this, which is understandable. It kind of, at face value, it seems like they want you to write about a 15-year-old in high school and who lives in Utah and nothing else. Like you can't go beyond that. I actually don't take that phrase to mean I can only write about a 30-something mom who's a writer and lives in Arizona. Like what I take that as, and I changed the phrase just a tiny bit to make it a little bit more clear. I use the phrase, use what you know. And that means you take those life experiences that you've had, the things that you've observed, the things that you've lived through, the emotions that you felt, all of those things, and you use that to add color and vibrancy to what your characters are going through. So, for example, when I was writing my first Regency that hasn't been published, it was kind of a tester, I guess, practice. I have this character who loses her father, and at that point, I hadn't lost anybody in my immediate family, but I had recently lost my grandfather. And so I tapped into what I had felt in that situation, the thoughts that I had and the emotions that I felt and the things that I wanted to do and didn't want to do and all of those. And I used that to help bring what this character was going through to life. And you can do that with so many things. Maybe you haven't had to say goodbye to somebody, but you've had to say goodbye to your best friend who is moving, or to your dog, or something like that. I mean, everybody has experienced joy, and everybody has experienced loss, and everybody has felt like they didn't belong. And so that's what I do. I use those instances. I try to find a time in my life when I felt similarly and use that to help me write my characters. Let's see, we like to hear about some of the books you've written and are currently writing. So Jordana's Secret came out in January. That was my first first published novel. I guess it was my fourth completed novel. And then I have 4 novellas, which they're like a third the size of a novel, just a quick read. You can finish it in a day. Those are all Regency as well. And let's see, my first one was called The Steadfast Heart, and it was based on the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, The Steadfast Tin Soldier. So that was really fun to write. My most recent novella was Commander of His Heart, about a young woman who is posing as a bosun on a little itty bitty ship. And yeah, so I've got 5 books out now. I have Beyond the Lavender Fields, which is a French Revolution book set in Provence in southern France, which will come out in February. And then I'm working on the sequel to that, which is set in, like I said, set in Brittany. How long did it take you to write your first novel? Well, my very first novel when I was 14, I think it took me 3 or 4 months. I had a lot of motivation. My friends were super supportive, and they basically wouldn't let me get on the bus in the morning unless I had another chapter for them. So that was super motivating for me. So yeah, I think that one was about 4 months. My next novel took me a little over a month. My third novel took forever. It took more than a year, I think. And then Georgiana's Secret took just over a month. Lavender Fields took a year. So it's different. It depends on the story. There are a lot of authors that kind of have it down to a science where it takes them exactly 4 weeks to finish a novel and all that. For me, it just depends. What types of books do you like to read? Do you like to read a lot of books outside of your genre? Right now, most of the books that I read are research books. I really like research books. There are a lot of authors that don't like the research side of it, and there are a lot of authors that are like, okay, stop your research, don't do any research while you're writing. But for me, I just do research all the time because I love it. It's one of my favorite parts of historical fiction, is just learning more about the people that came before me. So yeah, research books are kind of my big thing right now, but I have been trying to do more like pleasure reading already published books that I'm not beta reading, and all of that. I read a lot in genre, but I really like fantasy books. Really anything that's well written, I will enjoy. I think it is very wise to read outside of your genre. When you only read inside your genre, things can kind of get stale a little bit. And I think you can really learn from other genres. It's one thing that I think Brandon Sanderson does really well. He kind of mixes genres a little bit, and he pulls things from various genres as he's creating his stories, which I think is super smart. And it brings new life and new ideas to the genre. One example of this is A Song for the Stars by Elima Todd, who I think for the most part, she writes YA. I can't remember if it's YA sci-fi or YA fantasy. But she wrote this historical romance for my publisher, for the Proper Romance line. And it was so fascinating because she wrote it in first person, and she wrote it, I'm pretty sure it's first person present tense, and which you almost never see in, at least not in clean historical romance in our community. And just the voice of her character felt very YA fantasy, and it was so interesting to see a historical romance through a slightly different POV and style of telling. And actually, she inspired me with the way I do Beyond the Lavender Fields. I do a slightly different format where I have most of it is from a third person POV of my male character. And then we get the female character through letters that she writes, which are obviously first person POV, present tense. I mean, she goes past tense too, but with Eileen Matad, she was doing, she had kind of her real-time main character, and then she had her male main character writing journal entries, and they kind of went back and forth like that. So I think that you can learn a lot from reading outside of your genre, so I highly encourage that. How did you get your first book published? Well, technically my first published book was The Steadfast Heart, which I self-published, and I did that through Amazon. And it's actually a fairly easy process to get it, well, easy. Anybody can do it, but you do, I highly encourage going through the whole process of making sure you have really good edits and making sure there's a good cover and all of those things that a publisher usually takes care of for you. But when you're self-publishing, you kind of do all of that. So yeah, that was how I got my first one published. It's in a series with 4 other writers, my critique group, and we all got together and picked a theme, and we each picked a fairy tale to do a Regency retelling of. So that's how I got my first book published. As far as Georgiana, my first novel, I wrote it. I went through several rounds of edits and beta readers and critiques, and I sent it to my publisher, and then they got back to me and said they wanted it. So let's see. How do you overcome vulnerability when sharing your work? Oh, this is a really hard one. This is really hard because I am a really shy person, and I am someone who is very self-conscious, and it's hard. It's really hard. I think something that helped me was forming friendships with my critique partners. They're some of my best friends, and so that makes it a little bit easier sharing, having the first people that you share your work with be people that you know and people that you trust. I sometimes don't like to think about the fact that other people are reading my books because it makes me freak out a little bit. But it doesn't get completely, it doesn't ever completely go away, but it gets a little bit easier to just pretend like people aren't reading it. But the other thing is practice. A couple, how many years ago was it now? 3 years ago, 4 years ago? I made a goal that I was going to get into the writing community. I was going to be active. I was going to find people that I could connect with, and I was going to make myself share my work. Because that's the only way that you can, not the only way. That's one of the biggest ways that you can improve your writing is having other people read it and give you feedback on it. And so I set for the year, my goal was, I pick a word to be kind of the theme of my year. And that one was connect. My goal was to connect. I was going to connect with people. I was going to find critique partners. And I was really fortunate. I kind of fell into my critique group, and it was all because I made myself be brave. I made myself put myself out there a little bit, and it was hard. It was really hard. I didn't like it, but it was so good for me as a writer. Okay. Do you ever worry about your novel becoming too intense? Yeah, I do. Partially because I write clean romance, but I also write stories about war and stories about big things that happen to people with very hard emotions for some things. And one of the things that I was really worried about with Georgiana was that it was going to have too much war in it for clean romance readers, and that it was going to have too much romance for historical fiction readers. So yeah, I was definitely worried about that. I just in general, I don't write super gory, so I wasn't terribly worried about that, but just knowing my readers, I know that for some clean romance readers, it would be too much, or it would be just kind of right on the line of being too much for them. So yeah, it's something that I definitely worry about. And you just kind of have to know your readers, but in the end, just be true to the story that you want to tell. Because if you want to tell this story, there's going to be someone out there that wants to read it. So, what do you think about writing out certain problematic parts of history, such as slavery? Is it important to include those aspects in historical fiction, or is it okay to simply have a historical background without the problematic connotations? Oh, this is a big one. It's a really big one, and I think it's something that as a writing community, we're trying to figure out right now. It's something that I have grappled with, for sure. Especially in regards to slavery, because I know conversations that I've been in the writing community, especially where it deals with a topic like enslavement, with people who have been hurt by it for generations. There are some people who think, yes, we need to write this and it needs to be there. And there are some who think, yes, we need to write it, but it needs to come from the people who are affected by it. So it's actually something that I have been thinking a lot about recently and trying to decide what we do with it. Moving away from slavery specifically, because that one's just huge, and it's just so hard to have a set answer, because you ask the people who have been affected by it and you're going to get a million different answers about how they think it should be handled. But I think at the end of the day, you just need to look at it from a sympathy and an empathy perspective, and just try to do it justice, try to not hurt people. I think that's the biggest thing, is you don't want to hurt people, and if you're trying not to hurt people, you still might run into some problems, but I think if that's your intent, you'll figure it out. For me, going onto a slightly different topic from slavery, I was writing about the Royal Navy. And there are a lot of people who decide not to write the hard parts of this part of history. But I didn't want to shy away from that. I wanted to show the clean romance crowd this very real part of history. And it was a little bit difficult because, like I said, I'm a clean writer. And there were a lot of things that would not cut it with the clean romance crowd, as far as like swearing and relationships and all of those things that were very real parts of Royal Navy life. So it was just, again, just trying to make sure that I knew my audience. And as a writer, you're kind of like a cameraman in a movie. And you can't shoot all of the parts of the scene. It's not going to show up on your footage. You just can't. If you go too wide, then it's going to show a different picture, and there's just not room in that medium to show every single thing. And so as a writer, you get to choose where the camera points. And I do believe that you can portray a real moment of history without having every single thing in it. It's up to you as a writer to decide what needs to be in your shot. So I don't know if that answered your question, but okay.
Thank you so much for coming and answering our questions and letting us see things from your viewpoint. And so to everybody else, sadly that's the end of our meeting. But before you go, I do have a question for you guys. So our next meeting is going to be our last, and I want all of your guys' input on how we want to